Today is all about making a sketchbook cover using the Zentangle method. I'm using a simple piece of sketch paper, I'm using a set of drawing pens, and I'm using a circular composition just because I like the way the circles kind of overlap and it gives a nice organization to the shapes. The Zentangle method is a great way to learn how to make patterns and to draw intuitively. And if you're interested in more art tutorials, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss a weekly tutorial. Starting out, I'm using a pretty small piece of paper because the sketchbook I'm using is a smaller size, so you feel free to do this on whatever size paper that you would like or fits your situation. I'm tracing a circle. You do not have to make your base shape a circle. You could get rulers out. You could make them organic, free-flowing shapes. You could do a star, a heart, whatever. But I'm doing an initial inside a circle to start. My last name is Machado, and so I'm doing the letter M to represent that because I'm using this as a sketchbook cover. Now, you could just do an outline of the letter of your name. You could do any shape that you would like, but I like to do an initial for this because it just gives me ownership. It makes me really feel like my sketchbook is mine, obviously. And then I'm taking the same circle and I'm overlapping it several times to create little sections for my composition or my arrangement of my work of art. Now, you could do this any way that you would like. You don't have to do circles. Like I said, get out your ruler, freeform it. But I just find this to be a really interesting way to create, and I really like the structure that it provides. It's almost like little bubbles of pattern. Now that I'm happy with my composition, I'm taking the largest pen in the set that I have and outlining my letter because that is my area of emphasis. I want that part to be the boldest, to stand out the most, so I'm using my thicker pen. You can just double up your lines if you don't have but one pen that you're using, or you could even do this with like a thicker Sharpie and then do smaller details with a fine point Sharpie. I've done Zentangles with pencils before, so don't be limited by the supplies that you have. Try and think outside the box. Now I'm taking my second largest pen and I'm going to go through and outline the other circles so that they're really bold and they're going to have a nice outline for my patterns without taking the emphasis away from the letter M. This Zentangle from start to finish took me about 75 minutes to complete. I don't want this video to be 75 minutes, and since this is repetition, I'm just outlining lines you've already seen me draw with a pencil. I'm going to speed things up and do a time lapse so that we can get started with our Zentangle patterns. When doing the Zentangle method, I highly recommend having something that you're looking at. On this video, I do a lot of freehand, mainly because I lost my ruler. But it's always a good idea to have like patterns that you're looking at for inspiration. And this is a pattern I've done a lot of times. It's like a mermaid fishtail scallop pattern. But what I'm trying to do here is kind of stay small at the base and then gradually let each section get bigger. Now, I'm not much of a planner when it comes to Zentangle patterns. The reason why I like doing Zentangles is that I can kind of let my mind wander. I can put on music, I can put on a podcast and just really like let my hand take control. That's one of the reasons why I love teaching this technique is if you're a new artist, you can do really simple designs and feel successful. And if you're an experienced artist, you can really show off skills, detailed drawings, even shading, lots of fine points. And it kind of can work for an artist of any level. It can also work for people who need to relax. This is a great way to really practice mindfulness because you're not creating art that has to look exactly like something. It can really just be each section can have its own moment and its own purpose. Another thing I want to mention at the very beginning of this is this video is sped up. So I have time-lapsed certain sections, and what you're watching right now is actually double the speed of what I actually did in real life. Like I said, I did 75 minutes worth of work on this Zentangle, but for teaching and learning, you don't need to sit here and watch me step by step for 75 minutes. You can get the general idea, and the whole point in making a Zentangle is that it doesn't look like mine. It looks like whatever happens on your piece of paper for that day or that moment. So my hand is a little shaky. I can tell that this section I'm kind of like, oh, my first section is always a little bit weird, a little bit wonky. And so just try and ask yourself, okay, how can I connect these lines to make them look neater, or how can I make them look more intentionally messy? So I'm kind of going back in and double lining it so the lines that are a little wonky kind of have a purpose. So there's no mistakes in Zentangling. It's a process. You ask yourself, how can you make this more what you were trying to convey from the beginning? Try and let loose. The Zentangle method is a peaceful style of drawing based on structured patterns. So really try and get in the groove of just creating patterns without being too hard on yourself. This next section is one of my favorite doodles. It's simple. It's 3 lines. So you do 3 lines that are all going horizontally, and then right next to them you do 3 lines that are going up and down vertically. And then you just flip and rotate, filling up your space. It kind of has like a plaid or a braid type structure to it. I don't remember learning this pattern. I know I've been doing it a long time. I'm talking like doodling in my notebook in 7th grade math class, long time. It's one of those old patterns that's just like lodged in my head. So I always kind of go to that at the beginning of a Zentangle. I'm going back into my M, and I'm adding almost like a wood grain effect, and I'm using my very smallest, it's like 0.05 pen. I really like that fine point, and if you're lucky enough to have a pack of drawing pens, you can really play around with line quality and line weight, and play around with like how thick and thin your lines are. If you don't have a pen that has, or a pack of pens with a variety of points, just experiment by making your line as thin as you can by pressing down lighter and by pressing down harder or doubling up your line. Whatever works, don't feel limited by what supplies you have on hand. Try and make whatever you have work. You can do Zentangles with color, but for this one, I'm sticking to just a traditional black and white. This next section I love. It reminds me of giraffe print or maybe like rocks. And so I just drew an organic shape multiple times, filling up my circle or semicircle. And now I'm going back with my thickest pen and filling in the background black. I love a really nice black and white pattern. It really catches the eye. And for this one, I don't have a ruler. I don't know where in the world I put it. So I'm using the card that was on the inside of my pack of pens to create straight lines. Then I walked away from it. I knew I needed to put more detail in it, but I felt like it wasn't ready, so I'll come back to that section. This section is another pattern I've been doing forever, and I call it the spaghetti or the curly hair section. And what I do is I add just some nice like curly lines, and I make them thick, and I add it until I feel like the section isn't filled up, obviously, but it has like one coming into each little area, if that makes sense. And then I go back through with a smaller pen, or not, whatever you have, and I outline each little swirl, and then it really starts to look like curly hair or like a plate of pasta all twisted together. Man, that makes me hungry. And then you just keep repeating that, adding curls or overlapping the lines and concentric lines or lines that repeat next to each other until you fill up your whole space. It does create these little negative space areas that you fill with like random little lines. And I just love this pattern. This goes back to like, I don't know, 5th grade doodling in class. It's just one of those go-to patterns that I think looks really nice, and I have it stored away in my head. I'm going to go back and revisit my initials since this is the most important part of my work of art. And I'm just darkening some lines. You'll see me do that, kind of go back and forth, add things to sections that maybe I thought I was done. Because with the work of art, it kind of changes and grows as each section pops up. So you might think you finished an area, but then the relationships between the balance and the composition, the relationships between each section really do kind of work together. Now that I'm really warmed up and feeling confident about how this is turning out, I'm going to do a little risk taking with this section, and I'm going to do an eye pattern. Now, an eye is one of my favorite things to draw. It's one of my favorite motifs, and I think it just makes such a cool section. So I'm doing a really simple eye. It's a circle with a little bit of shading on the inside, and then I do the curved line on top, curved line on bottom, and just a few little eyelashes. So it's not supposed to be super realistic, but I want this section to kind of be like a wow section. I just think it makes a striking pattern. There's something really cool and creepy about a bunch of eyeballs looking back at you. And so far, I'm really happy with that section. This one, I'm adding some wavy lines. It makes me think of bacon at this moment. And I'm gonna just go back in and then do a wavy checkerboard. Now, a wavy checkerboard is exactly like a checkerboard, except your lines aren't straight. This section's a little small for that. I'm kind of losing focus on where my lines are. But basically, instead of just going straight across with a ruler, I do wavy horizontal, wavy verticals, and then fill in with a darker pen every other section for that traditional checkerboard look. Next, I'm going to do that same pattern I started with in the very first section, except for this one, I'm going to keep the little scallops the exact same size. This is a great go-to pattern because it's simple, it's easy, it looks really nice without much effort. So I'm kind of balancing out how much detail I'm putting in my sections. Same thing here, I'm getting a little lazy, so I'm like, I'll just do some zigzags. And anytime you do something and you feel like you need to change or edit it, go for it. I thought the zigzags were a little too similar to the 3 lines on the other side. So to balance things out, I'm doing a darker stripe to give it a contrast of more dark and light areas. My next section, I completely just made up as I went. And so I'm doing like a diamond section. And so the diamonds are imperfect. They're not straight lines. Now, if you're a very mathy, logical thinker, you would probably get your ruler out and measure and make sure they all kind of interact in the same way. But I like that it's got like a geometric quality to it, but it also has a quirkiness. And I wanted a really black and white section here, so I'm filling in with my darker pen the background so that it has that nice pop of contrast. Then I'm going in with my more thin pen and I'm adding a line inside the diamond to give it just a little bit more detail and pop. I'm going to go back and visit my stripe area, and I'm going to do something called hatching and create like a value scale of hatch marks inside each of the stripes. So you can see my pen is going crazy. I have sped this up twice the speed I actually did it. And hatch marks are so much fun because it's overlapping kind of like parallel lines. And then if you want to create value or areas of dark to light, you just kind of overlap and press down harder. Okay, this is in real time. This is how fast I actually go. If you're using a fine point pen, you want to be gentle because if you hatch a lot, you will mess up the tip of the pen. And this is a technique that is really fun. It's a great way to create texture and value. And I just love the scratchiness that it creates. Moving on, I'm going to do a square overlapping pattern. So this is a fun one to do because you can just kind of change the size of your squares. You can overlap as many or as little times as that you would like. A piece of advice is to make sure to go all the way off the edge in several sections. Don't just focus on full squares, but focus on going like where the squares would go out or off the page or into the line that separates each section, if that makes sense. I feel like I've done a lot of geometric straight lines and edges patterns, and so I was inspired by my eye. I want to do another section that's like the eye was like a wow section with my smaller pen, focusing on more realism. I eat a lot of strawberries and I have a whole bunch in my refrigerator, and so that image just popped in my head. It's something I've drawn before. It's a shape I think is cute. It's a shape I feel comfortable with. And so I'm going to fill this section with cute little strawberries. Same advice I gave before, make sure you're not just drawing the whole shape, but that you extend off your boundaries and have something showing like the bottom edges, the sides, and that's going to really enhance your work of art and just make it more interesting to look at. Let's speed this along a little bit. It's basically the same shape over and over again. I just love the fine point that this pen makes. All right, moving on to this top little section, I'm inspired by ribbons. And so I want to do this kind of like overlapping ribbon section. I'm freehanding it. Notice I never use a pencil except at the very beginning for my composition. If that makes you feel uncomfortable and you would prefer to like plan it out and draw it, go for it. But this took me 75 minutes just without using a pencil first. So I'm just going to jump right in. And as you've seen me do before, I want the ribbons to be white and the background to be black because I really like the idea of having some really dark and light areas. I was not happy with my craftsmanship or attention to detail in this section. I thought the ribbons started to look kind of, So I added a second line in between each one to give it the idea that like, oh, these lines are kind of random and wavy, and it makes my mistakes look a little bit more intentional. Let's try out some polka dots. I haven't done that before. So I'm just going to fill this section with some polka dots of about the same size. And then I'm going to go back in and make the lines a little bit thicker. And then for some reason I thought, let's add a little circle in the middle. It makes me think of olives or googly eyes. And so you could keep things really simple, but it's funny how just a little bit more attention to like line thickness and just extra details can make your sections pop. This is a really neat section, and I thought, okay, I'm going to go back in and take my thinner pen and add like a little line just to give it a little bit more gray area. This section is super simple. It's a stripe section using my fattest pen, and I'm going to try and do something that I really enjoy doing, and that's where I take my finger and smudge before it dries. This is a throwback to when I was obsessed with markers. And you can do this with markers too. It's really fun. And you take your finger and kind of rub in there before the marker dries. And that gives it a little bit of like a shaded or like a gray area. And I could have played around with that a little bit more. Speaking of attention to detail, I'm going back to this section I did that made me think of giraffe print or like stones on the ground. And I'm adding just a little dot. I think that gives it a little bit more detail. And like I said, you might think you're finished with this section and then have this really great idea, or you might say, it needs to be darker over here, or this section needs more gray, and just kind of go with it as you see different ideas to make your work of art finished. This section makes me think of paint splatter. I was not really sure what to do next. Sometimes with these small sections, I just do like quick lines just to fill the space. And because the section next to it was so black and white, I thought that was a really good way to do that. This turned out to be a really fun section. It's kind of like spirals that fill the space. So similar to the twisty hair or spaghetti sections, but with more tightly like circular spirals. I'm just adding them and then filling up sections until it's filled with lines that are about the same thickness and spread apart about the same. And because the lines are so similar, it gives it like a really nice gray area instead of black and white, if that makes sense. This section ended up being one of my favorites. I would love to do this again in maybe one of the larger sections. So I have filled up all of my sections, which I can't believe, and I want to give emphasis or a little more detail, really make this in my area of emphasis. Yes, it's in the center, it's the only initial, but I want to add a little something to the outer edges of the first circle I drew, just to make sure, like, yes, this section is supposed to be what you see first, the most important main area, even if some of my favorite patterns are in other sections. So I added just like a little zigzag around it. It makes me think of like a seal or a crest. And I'm just adding a little bit more detail to the M, especially because I added so much detail to the other sections. I feel like I want to jazz it up a little bit, really make that M for Machado stand out. You could add a little edge to each of your sections, but I, again, want this to really stand out. So I'm going to add a little black circle. Now it's making me think of like a crown all the way around this most important section of my Zentangle sketchbook cover. So I'm leaving my negative space in the background, basically anything that isn't a circle, white. You could fill it in with black. You could fill it in with a pattern, but that makes my brain hurt a little bit. You could fill it in with like your favorite color, or just leave it as an area of rest. There's something to be said for white blank areas in a composition, especially one as detailed and as busy as a Zentangle. I think I'm finished. If you want to turn this into a sketchbook cover, first, make sure it's the right size and shape for your sketchbook. And I'm really disappointed I turned my M the wrong direction. Then you're going to use packing tape. And I prefer the Duck brand, like duct tape. And you're going to go all the way across with a little extras on both sides and the top. Fold over the top slightly, as you see me doing here. And be careful, because once the tape touches your Zentangle, it will destroy it if you try to take it back off. Fold it over on both sides to create a protected sketchbook cover for all the things that might spill and ruin your design. So I definitely recommend having kind of measuring it out before you put it down. Do this slowly. Make sure it's really flat and flush on your sketchbook. The second one, you want to overlap a little bit, press it down firmly, wrap it over on both sides. Yep. And this is a really small sketchbook, so it takes me 3 pieces of tape to completely cover my design. Whereas when I do this with my students, they use the larger sketchbooks, and so I think it takes 5 or 6 per student. It's a little bit expensive to get the nice tape, but I promise it pays off. And I'll put my materials in the description box. Thank you so much for sticking around and making art with me. And if you're interested in more tutorials, check these out. Find me on Instagram at thatartteacher_Machado to see what I'm up to in my classroom, and find my website thatartteacher.com for full-length lesson plans and student examples.